Hello, welcome to English for Everyone, where we practice real-life American English. Today we're going to learn some very important vocabulary, so let's get started. First, let's look at these two verbs, preach and lecture. They're both verbs, and they're very similar. They mean to tell someone what to do, but in a bad way. Let's talk about the prepositions. Preach. You can preach to somebody or you can preach at somebody. It means you're telling them what to do according to their religion or according to your religion. It's about religion, about God. If someone tells you what to do and it's about a religion, they're preaching at you or they're preaching to you. So if you don't like this, you tell them, don't preach at me or don't preach to me. Either preposition is fine. Let's hear some examples of the verb preach.
Preach to me about family values and sexual education.
Don't you preach to me, you son of a bitch!
I want a realistic...
And don't you dare preach to me.
You gonna open that Bible and preach to me now?
Miss Riley, who are you to preach to me about mine?
Don't preach to me about duty, damn it, I wear the same.
But you will preach to them, you always do.
You know, I didn't come here to preach to you today.
I know you don't believe in God, Mrs. Anderson, but I won't preach to them. I just want to take them to church.
But you will preach to them, you always do.
Hey, I'm not going to preach to you. But those two guys in there, they're not rabbits.
Can I preach to him? Preach on.
Well, you do gotta dance in our shoes if you trying to preach to us.
If you're gonna preach, preach to me, but leave my daughter alone.
I'm not trying to preach to nobody.
What you do?
Don't give me that junk. Don't preach him.
Don't you?
You're not gonna preach at me, are you, honey?
So example, he told him not to do that because God doesn't like it. He says it's against God. Well, he didn't want to hear that, so he said, don't preach at me. Or I can use reported speech and say, he told him not to preach at him. So he said, don't preach at me. Or he told him not to preach at him. Let's practice. So he was telling him what to do according to his religion, and the other person didn't like it. What did he say? Did he say, don't preach at me? That's right, he said, don't preach at me. Let's practice with reported speech. What did he tell him? Did he tell him not to preach at him? That's right, he told him not to preach at him. Now let's talk about this verb, lecture. Pronunciation, use the short e like 10 in red, lek. We have the k sound plus the ch sound, lecture. Lecture, it's a verb, and there's no preposition. And it's not about religion. It's just somebody telling you what to do, but in a bad way. If someone's telling you, don't do that, do this, this is right, they're lecturing you. So you can say, don't lecture me. Let's hear some examples of the verb lecture.
Are you going to lecture me on justice?
Don't lecture me on what's dangerous, okay?
You, of all people, are going to lecture me on the morality of privacy?
You're in no position to lecture me on what real love is.
Don't lecture me on the law, Miss Riley.
So do not lecture me about living.
Don't you lecture me on the rules.
And you can sit here and smugly lecture me on the importance of tests?
Sit.
Oh, please don't lecture me about my daughter.
You ain't gotta lecture me on the whole foreign oil dependency routine.
I will not allow you to lecture me about the merits of emotion. No more.
Yeah, you don't have to lecture me. I know what to do.
Kids, don't you dare lecture me.
Don't lecture me about war.
Example, he buys cheap dog food for his dog. But his friend says, no, don't buy that cheap dog food. You need to buy better dog food. Your dog needs healthier food. He doesn't like this, so he says, don't lecture me about my dog. Don't lecture me about my dog food. Let's practice. What did he say? Did he say, don't lecture me? That's right, he said, don't lecture me. Or I can use reported speech. He told him not to lecture him. Let's practice. What did he tell him? Did he tell him not to lecture him? That's right, he told him not to lecture him about his dog or his dog food. So we have the verb preach with the preposition to or at. Preach to somebody or preach at somebody. And we have lecture, the verb lecture, with no preposition. You just lecture somebody. Where do these words come from? First, let's talk about preach. Preach comes from this: a preacher in a church, a pastor in a church. That's the verb. What does the preacher do? The preacher preaches to the people in the church. The pastor preaches to the people. In this case, we always use the preposition to when you're talking about a real preacher in a church. The preacher is preaching to the people in the church. So what is the noun? What is the thing he's giving? He's not giving a speech. We don't use speech in this case. The preacher is not giving a speech to the people. We call it a sermon, and it's countable. So we say a sermon. The preacher is giving a sermon to the church. He's preaching to the church, or he's giving a sermon. Sermon is the noun, and preach is the verb. And the person is a preacher or a pastor.
We'll have to listen to a sermon on the subject from Father Wells.
The 95 Theses, a sermon on indulgence and grace.
Instead of a sermon today, I think that we need to discuss the problem of rebuilding the church.
I'm going to ask Father Flood to preach a sermon on the dangers of giddiness.
But I'm not here to give you a sermon on situational ethics.
Let's practice. What is the pastor doing? Is the pastor preaching to the church? That's right. The pastor is preaching to the church. What is the pastor doing? Is the pastor giving a sermon? That's right. The pastor is giving a sermon, not a speech. It's called a sermon. Now let's talk about lecture. Where does this verb come from? This verb comes from school. At the university, the professor is giving a lecture. So we see it's a noun. It's the thing. He's not giving a speech. He's not giving a sermon. It's at a university, and he's a professor. So he's giving a lecture. Same pronunciation as the verb. Lecture. The professor is giving a lecture. He's giving a lecture. The students are listening to the lecture. It was a good lecture, or maybe it was a boring lecture. It's only a noun in this case. And it's countable, so we have to say a lecture.
I had to rush back from Paris to give a lecture at the new school.
It's for my class. I'm going to give a lecture in witchcraft.
If I had been that drunk, I wouldn't have been able to stand, much less give a lecture on integrated circuit.
I just gave a lecture to a standing room only crowd.
I guess they had someone lined up to give a lecture later this week, and he canceled on them.
You gave a lecture, and you told me to look you up when I got out. I just got out.
Just gave a brilliant lecture on the significance of the solar eclipse in Mayan mythology.
I think I once gave a lecture at the University of Missouri.
Let's practice. What is the professor doing? Is the professor giving a lecture? That's right. The professor is giving a lecture. Or I can say it in past. The professor gave a good lecture today in class. Let's practice. Did the professor give a good lecture today in class? That's right. The professor gave a good lecture today in class. So remember, when you use the verbs preach or lecture, they're very similar. But use the word preach when you're talking about something related to religion. Someone's telling you what to do according to their religion. That's preach. And the preposition, preach to somebody or preach at somebody. And it's not good. People don't like it. And lecture, very similar, but it's not about religion. It's just when someone tells you what to do, gives you instruction, and you don't like it. You don't want their information. You don't want their advice. You say, they're lecturing you. And you tell them, don't lecture me. I don't want to hear it. And there's no preposition. There's no at, there's no to, just don't lecture me. And remember where the words come from. If you're talking about church, the person is a pastor or a preacher, and the verb is preach. The preacher preaches to the people, or the pastor preaches to the people. And remember the noun. The noun is sermon. The pastor gives a sermon in church. And remember the noun lecture. The professor gives a lecture in class. But we don't use the verb in this case. Don't use the verb lecture. You cannot say the professor is lecturing the class. Only use the noun. The professor is giving a lecture in class. Thank you for watching. And if you like this video, subscribe to our channel. And if you want to become a member, click the join button. And we'll see you next time.